They call me Kaelith Shadowmere now. But that wasn't always my name. Once, I was just Mara, a village girl with nothing but ambition and a stubborn refusal to accept the word no. I was 13 when I decided to learn magic. Not because of some grand calling or mystical dream. I simply wanted to. And in my village, there was only one person who claimed to know magic. Aldrich the Wise, they called him. Though looking back, Aldrich the Fraud would have been more accurate. My village was the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your business. Small enough that the arrival of a traveling merchant was entertainment for the week. We had maybe 200 souls, a collection of farms and cottages clustered around a central square with a well and a meeting hall. The kind of place where tradition mattered more than ambition, where everyone had their place and questioning that place was considered both foolish and dangerous. Aldrich was our only claim to anything resembling the wider world. He was a portly man in his 50s, with a beard he clearly thought made him look distinguished, all carefully oiled and braided with little wooden beads woven through it. He wore robes covered in symbols that I later learned meant absolutely nothing, just decorative nonsense he'd probably copied from some illustrated manuscript without understanding. He spoke in that pompous way people do when they're trying to sound more important than they are, using elaborate words where simple ones would do, pausing dramatically as if every sentence deserved contemplation. The village believed in him completely. They'd seen him wave his hands and produce a few sparks. Watched him heal a minor wound with a touch of green light. Marveled when he made a light glow in his palm to illuminate a dark corner. Simple cantrips, I learned later, the kind of magic any journeyman mage could do in their sleep. But to villagers who'd never seen real magic, it might as well have been the power of the gods themselves. I watched him for months before I approached him. Studied what he did, tried to understand the patterns. There was something there, something real beneath all the theatrics and pomposity. I could feel it, even if I didn't yet have the words for what I was feeling. Magic called to something inside me, like recognizing a language you didn't know you could speak. My parents weren't happy about my interest. My mother especially. She was a practical woman, my mother, the kind who believed in hard work, proper behavior, and knowing your place. Magic was not women's work in her mind. Women were healers at best, tending to homes and husbands, bearing children and raising them properly. A girl interested in magic was like a girl wanting to be a blacksmith or a soldier, unnatural, she'd say. Unwomanly. But I was stubborn. Even then, I had confidence in myself, not the cocky arrogance of youth, but a quiet certainty about who I was and what I could do. So despite my mother's disapproval and my father's uncomfortable silence on the subject, I went to Aldrich's home one afternoon in late spring and knocked on his door. He opened it himself. He had no servants, no apprentices, just a woman who came twice a week to clean. He looked down at me with barely concealed irritation, clearly annoyed at being interrupted from whatever he'd been doing. I told him I wanted to be his apprentice. Wanted to learn magic. I'd work hard, I said. I'd do whatever was needed. I just wanted to learn. He laughed. Actually laughed in my face, a booming, condescending sound that made my cheeks burn with humiliation. A girl, he said, his voice dripping with scorn. Magic is not for women, child. Women are healers at best, tending to homes and husbands, bearing children. The arcane arts require a strength of mind and will that the fairer sex simply doesn't possess. It's not personal, he explained, as if that made it better. It's simply nature. The way of things. Women's minds are too soft, too emotional, too prone to distraction for the rigorous discipline magic requires. I kept my voice steady, though anger was building hot in my chest. Then test me, I said. If I'm truly incapable, you'll be proven right. But if I can do what you ask, you'll consider taking me on as an apprentice. He smiled then, that oily smile of a man who thinks he's already won, who's already planning how he'll describe this amusing incident to his drinking companions later. Very well, he said. If you can block a simple spell from me, I'll consider taking you on. But when you fail, and you will fail, you'll go home and forget this foolishness. You'll accept your place and leave magic to those capable of wielding it. By then, a crowd had gathered. Word had spread quickly, as it always did in our village, that someone was challenging Aldrich. My parents stood at the edge of the growing circle, my mother's face tight with worry and disapproval, my father's expression unreadable. Some of my neighbors looked excited, others skeptical. The blacksmith, old Brennan, was there. He'd never liked Aldrich's pretensions, had always thought the man was full of hot air. I could see a glint of amusement in his eyes. Aldrich made a show of it, of course. He rolled up his sleeves with elaborate care, revealing forearms that had seen very little actual physical labor. He muttered impressive-sounding words. Later I learned they were badly pronounced fragments of actual spell components mixed with complete nonsense. He raised his hand dramatically, fingers spread, and I felt it building, a bolt of force magic, crackling with energy. Blue-white light began to gather around his hand. To the villagers, I'm sure it looked devastating. Powerful. Dangerous. They stepped back, murmuring. Someone gasped. But to me, and I didn't understand why at the time, didn't have the knowledge to explain what I was experiencing, I could see the structure of it. The way the energy flowed, how it was shaped by his will, and the words he'd spoken. And I could see how basic it was. Simple. The magical equivalent of a child's first drawings, recognizable but crude. And somehow, instinctively, I knew how to counter it. I raised my own hand. I didn't speak any words, I didn't know any. I just felt for the energy I could sense all around us, invisible but present, and I willed it to respond. To form a barrier. A shield. A shimmering wall of translucent energy materialized in the air between us. It wasn't pretty. It had a rough, uneven quality to it, like imperfect glass. But it was solid. Real. His spell hit my shield and dissipated like mist in sunlight. The blue-white energy just scattered, absorbed, gone. The silence was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that village square. Everyone stared, at me, at Aldrich, at the space where his spell had vanished. Then the murmurs started, low and confused. What just happened? Did she really just do magic? How's that possible? I watched Aldrich's face cycle through emotions so quickly it was almost comical. Shock first, his eyes going wide and his mouth falling open. Then anger, a flush creeping up his neck and into his cheeks. Then calculation, as his mind worked through the implications. And finally, a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Well, he said, his voice tight and controlled. It seems I may have been too hasty in my assessment. You clearly have some natural aptitude, more than I anticipated. I was merely testing your resolve, of course. Seeing if you were serious about this pursuit. Everyone here heard you, I said calmly, keeping my voice level and clear. You agreed to train me if I blocked your spell. They all witnessed the terms. He looked around at the watching faces. Some were nodding. They had indeed heard the terms. Old Brennan was smirking openly now, arms crossed over his barrel chest, clearly enjoying seeing Aldrich caught in his own trap. The blacksmith had never had any reason to like the pompous mage, and seeing him forced to keep his word to a 13-year-old girl was evidently satisfying. Aldrich had no choice. The village had heard. If he went back on his word now, he'd lose face, lose the respect and mystique that were essential to his position. So he smiled again, wider this time, and said of course he'd meant to train me. That had been his intention all along. The test was merely a demonstration of his power, you understand. He'd held back considerably, naturally. Wouldn't want to harm a child with his full strength. Some people believed him. Many didn't. But it didn't matter. I'd won. I was going to learn magic. And so my training began. Looking back, I can see that Aldrich was a terrible teacher. Not because he was unwilling, though he certainly resented having been forced into it, but because he barely knew anything himself. He taught me the basics, the foundation that any mage needs, how to sense magical energy in the world around you, invisible but present in everything. How to shape that energy with will and word, imposing your intention on reality itself. How to speak the words of power that helped focus and direct that intention. But even those basics he taught poorly, with unclear explanations and obvious gaps in his own understanding. Still, I absorbed everything like parched earth drinks rain. Every lesson left me wanting more, needing more. The world of magic was opening up before me, vast and infinite, and I wanted to explore every corner of it. That's when I noticed his books. He kept them in a locked cabinet in his study, a room I was rarely allowed to enter, used only for our formal lessons. The cabinet was fine wood with brass fittings, clearly meant to look impressive and important. Through the glass doors, I could see ancient tomes with cracked leather bindings, grimoires that looked like they belonged in a king's library, not in the study of a village mage. The titles were in languages I didn't recognize, stamped in fading gold leaf. The first time I saw them, I felt that pull again, that sense of recognition, of something calling to me. Real knowledge was in those books. Real power. I could feel it. So one night, about 3 months into my apprenticeship, I picked the lock. It wasn't even a good lock. Basic mechanism, cheaply made. I'd watched Brennan the blacksmith work on locks before, had helped him a few times. Understanding how the pins aligned was simple enough. With a piece of bent wire and a little patience, the lock clicked open. The spells inside were revelation. Everything I'd been learning suddenly made sense, and simultaneously, I realized how much Aldrich had been keeping from me. These weren't the simple cantrips he'd been teaching. These were real combat spells. Fire conjured from nothing, bright and hot enough to melt steel. Illusions that could fool not just the eyes but all the senses, making someone believe completely in something that didn't exist. Wards that could deflect not just magic but physical weapons, crossbow bolts, sword strikes, anything. And I could tell, even as a novice, that these were still just journeyman spells. Advanced enough to be dangerous, yes. Powerful enough to matter in a real fight. But not master-level magic. These were the spells someone learned when they were becoming competent, not when they'd achieved true mastery. Which meant Aldrich had probably learned these spells years ago and then stopped. Never advanced beyond this level. Content to be the biggest magical fish in the smallest of ponds. I studied them in secret for months. At night, when Aldrich thought I'd gone home to my parents' cottage, I'd come back and pick the lock again. I'd copy diagrams and spell formulas into a notebook I kept hidden. Then I'd go into the woods beyond the village, far enough that no one would see or hear, and I'd practice. The spells came to me naturally. More than that, I could see their flaws. The inefficiencies in the patterns where energy was being wasted or poorly directed. The gestures that were more elaborate than necessary, theatrical rather than functional. So I began making adjustments. Small improvements. Testing variations to see what worked better. The fire spell, for example. The book showed a complex hand gesture and a 3-word incantation. But I found that with the right mental focus, I could reduce it to 2 words and a simple sweeping motion. The fire was just as hot, just as controllable, but it came faster. In a real fight, that half-second difference could mean life or death. Aldrich caught me eventually. I'd gotten careless, left one of the books slightly out of place. He noticed immediately. For all his faults, he was observant about his possessions. He stormed into our next lesson with rage written across his face. "You dare," he bellowed, his voice actually shaking with fury. "Those books are far too advanced for a mere apprentice. You could hurt yourself, or worse. You could damage the books themselves with your fumbling. I forbid you from touching them again. Do you understand me? They are forbidden to you." But I'd seen the fear beneath his anger. He couldn't do these spells. Any of them. He'd probably tried and failed, or never dared to try in the first place. And if I could master them, if I, a 13-year-old girl with less than a year of training, could do what he couldn't, it would shatter the illusion of Aldrich the Wise forever. He'd be exposed as what he truly was, a fraud with just enough real ability to fool people who knew even less than he did. So I became more careful. I continued my secret studies, but I made sure to leave no trace. I memorized the exact position of each book before I removed it, placed it back precisely. I practiced my spells even deeper in the woods, where not even the sound would carry back to the village. And I continued to grow stronger. 3 months after he'd caught me with his books, Aldrich made his move. He announced it in the village square with great fanfare on a market day when everyone was gathered. He'd been planning this clearly, had dressed in his finest robes, made sure to time it for maximum audience. He stood on the steps of the meeting hall and proclaimed in his most pompous voice that he would take me as his wife. The crowd cheered. This was wonderful news in their eyes. My parents, standing near the front, because Aldrich had clearly warned them this was coming, beamed with pride. Their daughter marrying the powerful wizard. What an honor. What a blessing for our family. Several girls my age looked at me with undisguised envy, wishing they were the ones being chosen by the great Aldrich. I saw right through it. This was his solution to the problem I represented. Bind me to him in marriage while I was still young and controllable. As my husband, he'd have legal authority over me, over my magical training, over everything I learned and did. He could keep me from ever surpassing him, or, more likely, he'd take credit for my growing abilities. Present them as his own power, channeled through his dutiful wife. The clever wizard who'd recognized my potential and shaped it to his purposes. So when he finished his grand speech and turned to me with an expectant smile, waiting for my grateful acceptance, I said simply, no. The square went silent. You could see the smile freeze on his face, like water turning to ice. What did you say? He asked, his voice dangerous now, the false joviality gone. I said no, I repeated, louder this time so everyone could hear. I won't marry you, Aldrich. I'm 13 years old. I'm your student, not your future wife. Now if we're done with this farce, I have studying to do. And I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there on the steps of the meeting hall, humiliated before the entire village. I should have known he wouldn't let it go. Should have recognized the danger. But I was 13 and powerful, and I just publicly embarrassed him. I wasn't thinking about consequences. The next day, he called me to his home for what he said was a private lesson. I went, thinking perhaps we could move past the awkwardness. Maybe he'd accept my refusal and we could return to our teacher-student relationship. I was naive. The moment I entered, he locked the door behind me. I heard the bolt slide home and turned to see the smile on his face, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was predatory. Hungry. Wrong. You think you can refuse me, he hissed, dropping all pretense of civility. You think you're better than me? I'll show you your place, girl. He lunged at me. He was bigger, heavier, stronger. We struggled, and despite my magical training, I was still a 13-year-old girl against a full-grown man. He forced me to the ground, his weight pinning me down. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His hands grabbed at my clothes, tearing. Terror and rage warred in my chest. This couldn't be happening. I wouldn't let this happen. Then training took over, not magical training, but something more basic. Survival instinct. My fingers found his eyes. I pressed hard, pushed my thumbs in. He screamed, a horrible high-pitched sound, rearing back. I brought my knee up hard between his legs with everything I had. He made a strangled, choking noise and crumpled, and I rolled free, scrambling to my feet and putting distance between us. He was clutching himself with one hand, the other over his ruined eye. I'd pushed hard enough to damage it badly. Blood and worse seeped between his fingers. But I could see murder in his expression, in his one good eye. The pain was making him more dangerous, not less. He was reaching for his magic. I could feel the energy building. I reached mine first. Fire had always come easiest to me. There was something about the element that resonated with my nature, perhaps the anger I kept so carefully controlled, perhaps something deeper. The spell I'd been practicing, one from his forbidden books, one he'd never dared attempt, roared to life in my hands. Flames erupted across his body like a living thing. His screams were inhuman. Horrible. The smell of burning flesh and hair filled the room, acrid and wrong. It made me want to vomit, but I didn't look away. Couldn't look away. I watched him writhe on the floor of his study, watched the flames consume him. When his screams had reduced to whimpers, when the fire had burned down enough that I could see the damage, I walked closer. He looked up at me with his remaining eye. The other was a burned ruin. His face was a mask of charred flesh, red and black and weeping. He tried to speak, but I wasn't interested in his words anymore. You thought so little of women, I said softly, looking down at him. And a 13-year-old girl just defeated you. How does that feel, Aldrich the Wise? He tried to speak again, to beg maybe, or curse me, or explain. I didn't give him the chance. I'd been practicing another spell from his books, life-draining magic, dark and terrible. The kind of spell that left a mark on your soul, they said, though I didn't believe in souls then. I'd even improved it, made it more efficient, more thorough. I placed my hand on his forehead and spoke the words. The spell pulled his life force out of him like water from a well. I could feel it flowing into me, his strength, his remaining vitality, his very essence. His already ruined body shriveled, the burns seeming to worsen as the flesh dried and cracked. When I lifted my hand, there was nothing left but a blackened husk, barely recognizable as human. I stood there for a moment, looking at what I'd done, waiting for guilt or horror or regret, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. Then, methodically, I gathered his useful spellbooks. I knew which ones had real knowledge and which were just props for his image. I packed them in my satchel, all the ones I hadn't already mastered, and a couple with more advanced magic I'd only just begun to study. Finally, I set his house on fire. I'd like to say it was to cover the evidence, to hide what I'd done. But really, it was because I wanted to. Because that house represented everything he'd tried to do to me. The dismissal, the manipulation, the assault. And I wanted it all to burn. I walked out as the flames began to spread. It was evening by then. People were starting to gather for the evening meal in the square. They saw me emerge, books weighing down my satchel, bruises darkening on my face and arms where he'd struck me during our struggle. My clothes were torn. There was soot on my hands and face. They looked at me with fear. Some with disgust. The smell of burning meat, unmistakably human flesh, drifted from the open door behind me. No one asked what happened. No one needed to. They could see. They could smell. They could put the pieces together. My parents were waiting when I arrived home. My father demanded to know what I'd done. When I tried to explain the attack, how he'd tried to rape me, how I defended myself, my mother cut me off. "You've ruined everything," she said, her voice cold and hard. "He was willing to marry you despite your unfeminine pursuits, despite your unseemly interest in magic. And you killed him? What man will want you now? You've shamed this family. Shamed yourself." My father said nothing. He couldn't even look at me. But his silence spoke louder than any words. He was disappointed. Ashamed. Of me. Not of Aldrich for what he'd tried to do, but of me for defending myself. Over the next few days, my mother's comments grew sharper, more cutting. How I'd never marry now. How I'd shamed the family. How I'd die alone, unwanted, a disgrace. Each word was designed to hurt, to remind me what I'd lost by refusing to be a victim. My father maintained his silence. Sometimes silence is worse than shouting. At least shouting is engagement, is emotion. His silence was erasure. I'd become invisible to him, unworthy of acknowledgement. I lasted 4 days before I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things in the middle of the night, clothes, my precious books, what little money I had saved. I wrote no note. Offered no goodbye. The town was 2 days' travel south. I'd heard there were proper mages there, not frauds like Aldrich. Real teachers who could show me how to control this power that was growing inside me like a wildfire. I left before dawn, while the village still slept. I never looked back. The road was quiet that first day. I kept a steady pace, my satchel of books heavy on my shoulder but precious. Each step took me further from the village, from my parents' disappointment, from the memory of Aldrich's ruined face. I should have felt free. Instead, I felt empty. Hollow. I camped that first night in a clearing off the road, not daring to make a fire in case it attracted attention. I ate dry bread and cheese I'd taken from my parents' kitchen, drank water from a stream. The stars above were bright and cold and indifferent. That's when the doubts came. In the darkness, alone, with nothing but my thoughts for company. I'd killed a man. Not in battle, not in a fair fight, but in rage and vengeance. Yes, he'd attacked me first. Yes, he'd tried to do something horrible. But I'd gone beyond defense. I'd tortured him with fire, then drained his life while he was helpless. That wasn't protection. That was execution. And I'd felt nothing. No guilt. No horror. Just satisfaction. What did that make me? I pushed the thoughts away. Forced myself to remember his hands tearing at my clothes, his weight pinning me down, the fear and rage. He'd made his choice. I'd made mine. That was all there was to it. But sleep was long in coming that night. The second day brought bandits, or maybe they were just desperate men. The line was thin. 3 of them stepped out from the trees, weapons drawn. They saw a young girl, alone, with a satchel that looked heavy and valuable. Easy prey. I tried to warn them. Told them to let me pass, that they didn't want this fight. They laughed. Made crude suggestions about what they'd do before they killed me. So I showed them what I'd learned from Aldrich's forbidden books. The first man died quickly, lightning to the heart, over in a second. The second took longer, fire consuming him while he screamed. The third I only meant to disable, a force blast to break his legs so he couldn't chase me. But I'd put too much power into it. The blast didn't just break his legs, it shattered them. Bone fragments, blood, horrible screaming. I used the life-draining spell again. Partly to put him out of his misery. Partly because I wanted to study how it worked, how the energy flowed. Partly because some dark part of me was curious to feel that power again. When it was done, I searched their bodies. Found a few coins, mostly copper. They'd been as desperate as they looked. And I'd killed them for it. No. They'd attacked me. Made their choice. This was just survival. But the hollow feeling grew deeper. I found the horses they'd stolen, probably from other travelers they'd robbed or killed. 3 of them, tied in a clearing. I'd never learned to ride properly, another oversight in my village education. But I managed to mount the best of them, a bay mare with intelligent eyes. She tested me, sensing my inexperience, but I held firm. I needed to be firm. Needed to show no weakness. The town appeared on the afternoon of the second day. Larger than my village, with actual stone walls and guard towers. The bustle of commerce, the crowd of people. Civilization. I sold 2 of the horses to a stableman who asked no questions about a young girl traveling alone with 3 mounts. The gold he gave me was more than I'd ever held in my life. Enough to survive for months if I was careful. The inn was called the Copper Bell. The innkeeper tried to refuse me at first. We don't rent to children, but coin has a wonderful way of changing people's policies. I took a room for 3 nights, had my things brought up from the stable, and finally, I was safe. Or as safe as I could be, at least. That night, lying in an actual bed for the first time since leaving home, I pulled out Aldrich's books and began to study in earnest. The fire spell. The force magic. The life-draining curse. Each one had nuances I'd missed in my rushed nighttime studies. Each one could be improved, refined, made more efficient. I lost myself in the learning. Let it fill the hollow space inside me. Magic made sense in a way people never did. Magic had rules, structures, patterns. Magic didn't judge you or disappoint you or make you feel small. Magic just was. And I was going to master every bit of it I could find. The next morning, I began my search for a new teacher. The town had several people who claimed magical ability, a hedge witch who sold charms and potions, a traveling illusionist who did tricks in the square for coin, even a scholar who studied ancient texts, but admitted he couldn't actually cast spells himself. None of them were what I needed. The hedge witch's magic was all herbs and minor enchantments, nothing like the raw power I'd experienced. The illusionist was a performer, not a true mage. And the scholar, for all his knowledge, had no practical experience. By the 3rd day, I was growing frustrated. I'd come all this way, burned all my bridges, killed 3 men on the road, and for what? To find another town with no real magic? That's when the scholar mentioned Torvin. He was reluctant to do so. Said Torvin wasn't what I was looking for. That he was a broken man, a drunk, not someone I should waste my time on. But when I pressed, when I insisted I needed to know about everyone in town who knew real magic, he finally told me. Torvin Ironbrand. Once a battle mage in the king's 3rd army. Lost his arm and most of his power in a battle against a lich. Now he lived on the edge of town in a rundown house, did occasional repair work on magical items when he felt like it, and mostly drank to forget what he'd lost. Not a pleasant man, the scholar warned. Not someone who'd want to teach. Especially not a child. But he was real. He'd fought real battles, faced real threats. He'd know magic in a way none of these town charlatans did. So I found his house. It wasn't hard, east side of town, the scholar had said, and there was only one house that matched the description. Rundown was generous. The garden was overgrown with weeds, the shutters hung crooked, the whole place had an air of neglect and decay. I knocked on the door. "Go away," a voice shouted from inside. Rough, bitter, slurred slightly. Definitely drunk. I knocked again. The door flew open. The man who stood there matched the scholar's description, but was somehow worse than I'd imagined. Gray-haired, weathered face deeply lined, clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. His right arm ended just below the elbow in a mass of scar tissue. And his eyes, even dulled by alcohol, they were sharp, intelligent, and very, very angry. What part of "go away" was unclear, he growled. "I need a teacher," I said simply. "I'll work. I'll pay. Whatever you want." He looked me up and down, then snorted. "A child. Perfect. Run along, girl. Magic isn't a game." I raised my hand and conjured fire. Not a spark or a flicker, but a sphere of flame that danced in my palm, bright and perfectly controlled. The heat from it made the air shimmer. Torvin's expression changed. The dismissiveness vanished, replaced by shock, then calculation. He stared at the fire, then at me. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp and focused. "Books," I said. "But I need a real teacher. Someone who actually knows what they're doing." He was silent for a long moment, studying me with those sharp eyes. I could see him evaluating, considering, trying to decide if I was worth the effort. "Get in here," he finally said, stepping aside. "And put that damn fire out before the neighbors see." I extinguished the flame and entered his home. The inside matched the outside, cluttered, dirty, smelling of old alcohol and neglect. Books were stacked everywhere, most covered in dust. Empty bottles lined the shelves. But beneath the mess, I could see the remnants of order. This had once been a scholar's home, a mage's study. It had just fallen into decay along with its owner. Torvin sat heavily in a chair, gesturing for me to take another. He pulled a bottle from a nearby table, took a long drink directly from it. Then he looked at me properly, really looked, and I saw him take in the details. The new clothes that didn't quite fit. The too old look in my eyes. The way I held myself, ready to fight or flee. "You're running from something," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I answered honestly. There was no point lying. He'd see through it. "Did you kill someone?" I considered lying about this. But again, what was the point? "Yes. 3 people. Self-defense, all of them, but yes." He took another drink. "How old are you?" 13. 13, and you've already killed 3 people. And you can cast fire magic well enough to control it precisely." He shook his head. "You're either a prodigy or a disaster waiting to happen. Maybe both." "Will you teach me?" I asked. "Why should I? I'm a drunk and a cripple. I'm done with magic, done with fighting, done with everything. I just want to be left alone to drink myself into an early grave." "Because you're the only real mage in this town," I said. "Because you know things these others don't. Because you've faced real threats and survived. And because I think part of you misses it. Misses the magic, the power, the purpose." His expression flickered, anger, then something that might have been pain. "You don't know anything about me, girl." "Maybe not," I admitted. "But I know what I saw in your eyes when I showed you that fire. Recognition. Interest. You're not as done as you pretend to be." Another long silence. He drank again, nearly emptying the bottle. "Fine," he said finally. "I'll teach you. But I'm not going to coddle you. I'm not going to be nice about it. If you're stupid, I'll tell you. If you make mistakes, I'll call you out. And if you waste my time, I'll throw you out and never let you back in. Understand?" "I understand," I said. And his teaching began. Torvin was everything the scholar had warned me about. He was gruff, often cruel with his words. He called me stupid, clumsy, short, scrawny, every insult he could think of. He'd critique my spell work with savage precision, pointing out every flaw, every inefficiency, every moment of sloppy technique. But I noticed something important. He never insulted my magic itself. Never questioned my ability or my power. Only my inexperience, my lack of refinement, my tendency to use brute force instead of precision. And his teaching was real. Proper. He showed me how to refine my control, how to layer spells for complex effects, how to sense the different types of magic and understand their uses. He taught me to identify magical items, a skill I struggled with more than I'd like to admit. I was only moderately talented at it, which frustrated me. I'd gotten used to magic coming easily. But when it came to imbuing magic into objects, creating enchanted items, I excelled. The flow of magic into physical form came naturally to me, intuitive in a way identification never was. It was like the difference between reading about fire and actually conjuring it. One was academic, the other was visceral and real. We took jobs together, repairing and enchanting items for townspeople. A merchant needed better wards on his lock. A hunter wanted his bow made more durable. Someone needed a lantern that would never go out. The work paid for my room and board, and I learned with every piece. The jobs became our routine. Torvin would assess what needed to be done, explain the theory, then watch as I worked. His critiques were harsh, but always accurate. When I made mistakes, he'd make me start over, wouldn't accept anything less than proper craftsmanship. Slowly, over the months, he began to open up. Small things at first, a comment about a battle he'd fought, a mention of places he'd seen. Eventually, he told me about the war. About the lich he'd faced with his company of adventurers. About the spell that had taken his arm, the necrotic magic that had eaten away his flesh despite the healer's best efforts. About the friends who died protecting him while he escaped. I was Torvin Ironbrand, he said one evening, staring into his cup of cheap wine. Battlemage of the King's Third Army. Court wizard to Lord Hendrix. I fought demons and dragons. Now I'm just a one-armed drunk in a backwater town. You're my teacher, I said quietly. And you're a good one. He looked at me surprised, then looked away quickly. But I saw something in his eyes soften, just for a moment. Over the 2 years I studied with him, Torvin taught me more than magic. He showed me how magic could help people, protect them. He never asked about my past, never pried into why a 13-year-old girl had arrived alone with a satchel full of advanced spellbooks. But he made sure I understood that power without principle was just destruction. Magic is a tool, he'd say, usually while critiquing my latest enchantment work. Like a sword. It cuts what you point it at. Make sure you're pointing it at the right things. He was the first person since my parents who'd cared about me as more than a means to an end. Not because of what I could do for him, not because of my potential power. He cared because he was a teacher, and I was his student, and that relationship meant something to him. I was 15 when he called me into his study one morning. He looked tired, more than usual. Older. His color was off, grayish. There's a man in the capital, he said without preamble. Sorcerer named Valdris. We adventured together years ago, before the Lich. He's got connections, resources. He's court mage to the governor now. He can teach you things I can't, not with one arm and half my power gone. He pushed a sealed letter across the table to me. Take this to him. Tell him I sent you. He'll take care of you. You could come with me, I said, though even as I spoke, I knew the answer. He shook his head slowly. I'm done traveling, girl. My time is almost up. I can feel it. This body has taken too much damage, fought too many battles. But you're just getting started. Don't waste what you've learned here. Don't waste what you could become. I took the letter, though my hands were shaking. I'd known this moment would come eventually. Nothing lasts. But knowing it and feeling it were different things. Thank you, I said. For everything. For teaching me. For caring. He waved a hand dismissively, but his expression was softer than I'd ever seen it. You're a pain in my ass, girl. Stubborn, reckless, too powerful for your own good. But you're also the best student I've ever had. Make something of yourself. Something good. I left 3 days later. The journey to the capital would take nearly a week. I packed carefully, made sure I had everything I needed. When I came to say goodbye, Torvin was already deep in his cups, deliberately avoiding any emotional farewell. Go on, he said gruffly. Get out of here. And don't come back unless you've learned something worth showing me. I nodded, not trusting my voice. And I left. 2 days into my journey, a messenger found me on the road. He'd been sent from the town. Torvin had passed in his sleep the night after I'd left. I stood there on that dusty road, holding the message, and felt something crack inside me. Not break, I was too hardened for that already. But crack. A fissure in the walls I'd been building around myself. He was the only mentor who'd ever actually cared about me. The only one who'd taught me without trying to control me, use me, or take credit for my growth. And now he was gone. I made sure his gravestone was properly carved. Paid for it with money I'd earned from our enchanting work. Had them inscribe it with his full name and title, Torvin Ironbrand, Battlemage Teacher. And I carried his lessons with me, not just the magic, but the principle behind it. The idea that power should be used for something more than just power's sake. But even then, I could feel that lesson starting to slip away. With every day, with every mile toward the capital, the world felt harder, colder, more dangerous. I reached the capital a week later. It was overwhelming. I'd never seen so many people, so many buildings reaching toward the sky. The noise, the smells, the sheer press of humanity. It took days just to adjust, to learn to move through crowds without feeling suffocated. Finding Voldris took longer than I expected. He was advisor to the governor, housed in the administrative quarter behind guarded gates. It took 3 attempts and Torvin's sealed letter before I was finally granted an audience. When I finally entered his study, I understood immediately why Torvin had been hesitant in his recommendation. Voldris was everything Torvin wasn't, polished, elegant, his robe's finest silk embroidered with gold thread. His study was filled with artifacts worth more than my entire village, his shelves lined with books that made my collection look like children's primers. And the way he looked at me, barely concealed disdain, like I was something unpleasant he'd found on his shoe. So, he said without bothering to stand or offer a greeting, "Torvin sends me a girl." How typical of him. Always the sentimental fool. I handed him the letter. He broke the seal, read it, and something flickered across his face. Not concern. Voldris didn't seem capable of genuine concern. But old resentment, perhaps. An ancient grudge resurfacing. Torvin always did think highly of himself, Voldris muttered. Then, louder, "Very well. If the old fool recommends you, perhaps you have some talent. Show me what you can do." I demonstrated what I'd learned: fire, lightning, barriers, a levitation spell, some basic enchanting techniques. He watched with increasing interest, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of boredom. "Adequate," he said when I finished, though his eyes said more. "I suppose I can find time to refine your rough skills. But you'll earn your keep. I have work that needs doing, and an apprentice should be useful, not just decorative." And so, at 15, I became Voldris's apprentice. I also took a new name. Partly to mark my transition to adulthood, partly to make it harder for anyone from my past to find me. The capital was a place of reinvention, after all. Mara died on the road from that small town. In the capital, I became Kaelith Shadowmere. The first year was everything I'd hoped for. Voldris was an exceptional teacher, harsh, demanding, but incredibly knowledgeable. He taught me advanced elemental magic, how to manipulate all 4 elements with equal skill. Fire had been my strength, but under him, I learned to call storms, reshape earth, freeze water in an instant, and ride the wind itself. He showed me how to layer defensive spells until they were nearly impenetrable. How to create illusions so real they could fool even trained mages, not just visual tricks, but constructs that affected all the senses, that could fool someone into believing completely in something that didn't exist. He taught me enchanting at a level Torvin never could have, showing me techniques that had been lost for centuries. How to bind powerful magics into objects without the magic degrading over time. How to create items that would last for generations. I drank it all in, growing stronger with every lesson. But he also gave me tasks. Practice exercises, he called them. Simple applications of what I was learning. "There's a merchant," he'd say casually. "I need him to agree to certain trade terms. Use your mind magic to make him more amenable to my suggestions." Mind magic came naturally to me, almost frighteningly so. I could slip into thoughts like sliding into warm water. Plant suggestions that felt like the person's own ideas. read surface memories as easily as reading a book. It was intoxicating, that power. The ability to know what people were really thinking, to shape their decisions without them ever knowing. So I did what Valdris asked. Made the merchant more agreeable. It was just practice, after all. Just an exercise in control and precision. Over the next year, the tasks became more frequent and more complex. A dignitary who needed to be convinced to vote a certain way. A rival merchant whose confidence needed adjustment so he'd make poor business decisions. A judge who needed to forget certain evidence. Each time, Valdris would frame it as necessary, as practice for becoming a great sorceress. And I believed him. Or I wanted to believe him. Or maybe I just didn't care enough to question it. The magic was too fascinating, the learning too addictive. Then there were the assassinations. The first one, Valdris presented as an emergency. There's a threat to the governor, he told me one night, his face grave with concern. A man planning to kill him. I've tried to warn the target, but he's paranoid, armed, dangerous. He'll attack anyone who approaches. You need to stop him before he can act. So I went. Found the man in a warehouse on the docks. And when I approached, he did attack, drew a weapon, used some minor combat magic. So I defended myself. Fire, quick and final. He died screaming. Valdris congratulated me on saving the governor's life. Called me a hero. Gave me a bonus payment for the dangerous work. It happened 3 more times over the following months. Always the same setup. A threat to the governor or to someone important. Always someone who attacked first when I approached. Always Valdris's praise afterward for protecting innocent lives. I never questioned it. Never wondered why all these threats happened to attack first. Never considered that maybe Valdris was setting them up to look dangerous, making them panic so I'd feel justified in killing them. I was 17 when I discovered I could read minds completely, not just surface thoughts, but deep memories, hidden secrets, the true self that people buried beneath their public face. Valdris was fascinated. He had me practice on dignitaries attending the governor's functions. Learn what you can, he'd say. Information is power, after all. The secrets I uncovered were enlightening. Affairs, embezzlement, hidden alliances. Treasons both petty and profound. I'd report them to Valdris, and he'd smile and thank me. And then those people would suddenly find themselves in compromising positions, doing exactly what Valdris wanted. I was too focused on the learning to question it. Every day brought new spells, new techniques. I was becoming powerful, more powerful than I'd ever imagined possible. That's all that mattered. Until the night the governor died. It was sudden. A heart attack, they said. Unexpected but not unheard of. The man was old, overweight, stressed from his position. Valdris performed the eulogy himself, speaking movingly about loss and duty and continuing the governor's great work. The council appointed him interim governor within 3 days. And within a week, everything changed. I arrived for my lesson to find Valdris transformed. The mask of mentorship had fallen away, replaced by cold, calculating ambition. The false warmth was gone from his eyes. You've been very useful, Kaelith, he said without preamble. Quite useful indeed. But you've become problematic. You know too much. You've seen too much. And frankly, you've grown too powerful. I can't have you as a rival. It took a moment for his words to register. Then I understood. The governor hadn't died of natural causes. The threats I'd eliminated weren't real threats. They were obstacles to Valdris's plans, people who would have questioned his rise to power. The mind magic, the secrets I'd uncovered, all of it had been tools for his manipulation, for his consolidation of power. And I'd been his weapon. His assassin. Without ever realizing it. Before I could react, he attacked. Battle magic, the kind that levels buildings. I barely got my shields up in time, and even then they cracked under the assault. We fought, and I realized with growing horror that I couldn't win. Not yet. He was too skilled, too experienced. In a few more years, maybe I'd be his equal or better. But not now. So I ran. Illusions, misdirection, anything to buy time. His spells chased me through the administrative quarter, destroying walls, shattering windows. I made it to the streets and lost myself in the crowds, using every trick I'd learned about hiding and deception. But I knew I wasn't safe. Within hours, the city guard was looking for me. Valdris had gotten ahead of the story, branded me as the governor's assassin, as a rogue sorceress who'd turned on her master. Wanted posters appeared overnight, my face rendered in stark detail. The reward was staggering, 10,000 gold. I tried to be gentle at first with the guards who found me. Stunning spells, barriers, just enough to escape. Surely they'd realize Valdris was lying. Surely they'd stop coming. But more kept arriving. And they weren't trying to capture me, they had orders to kill. I heard them say it. Too dangerous to take alive. Kill on sight. So I stopped being gentle. Fire. Lightning. Force magic that shattered bones and crushed organs. I left a trail of bodies through the merchant quarter, fighting my way toward the city gates. Each death was necessary. Each death was survival. I told myself that. Made myself believe it. I finally escaped the city as night fell. Stumbled into the wilderness beyond the walls, exhausted, wounded, wanted in every kingdom. And as I sat in a cave that first night, tending my injuries and trying to process what had happened, reality crashed down on me. Everything, the mind control, the practice on dignitaries, the threats I'd killed, it had all been manipulation. Valdris had used me to consolidate his power, to eliminate rivals, to position himself to take the governor's place. And then, when I became inconvenient, when I knew too much, he'd tried to dispose of me. I'd been such a fool. My desire to learn, to grow stronger, had blinded me completely. I'd become his weapon without even realizing it. Every person I'd manipulated, every threat I'd killed, every secret I'd uncovered, all of it had been in service of his ambition. And now I was alone, hunted, branded a murderer and traitor. I vowed it would never happen again. Never again would I be someone's tool, someone's weapon. Never again would I trust blindly, would accept what I was told without question. From now on, I would rely only on myself. My power. My judgment. My choices. Even if those choices were wrong, at least they'd be mine. I sat in that cave for 3 days, healing, planning, deciding who I would become. Mara was long dead. Kaelith Shadowmere the student was dead too. I would have to become something new. Something harder. Something that could survive in a world that wanted me dead. I just didn't know yet what that would cost me. What I'd have to sacrifice, who I'd have to become. The path ahead was dark, and I was walking it alone. But I was alive. And I was powerful. And I would survive. Whatever it took.